off. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Emma Cole from the University of Queensland, who will be talking on Rehearsal as Mythopoiesis, Developing Punchdrunk's The Burnt City. Emma is a senior lecturer in drama at the University of Queensland. Previously, she was senior lecturer in liberal arts and classics at the University of Bristol and an AHRC Innovation Fellow. She's a classicist and theatre historian and is an expert on Greek tragedy in contemporary theatre. She has authored Punchdrunk on the Classics in 2023, Post-Dramatic Tragedies in 2019, and was co-editor on Adapting Translation for the Stage in 2017. Her current research focuses on ancient literature and immersive experience. Alongside her research, she works as a dramaturg on new writing and classical adaptation projects, including on Punchdrunk's The Burnt City, which we're going to hear a bit more about today. So I'm really delighted that Emma's joining us. Our paths didn't quite cross while we were both in Bristol, but I've been fascinated by her work and really excited to hear more about it. So over to you, Emma.
Thank you so much, Harry. I'm so delighted to be joining you all today. I'm just going to share my screen while I say that. I'm so delighted to have been invited to speak for your TaBS seminar and to see some familiar faces from Bristol. I miss you all and to see such a great turnout. Thank you for giving up some time to everyone who's come along today to talk. As Harry said, my name is Emma Cole. I am a cis white woman in her mid-30s with dark brown hair, wear glasses, and today I've got a kind of emerald green v-neck dress on. In Queensland, it's very hot. It's about 30 degrees Celsius and very humid. So I'm in linen, short sleeve, short dress. Yes, that is me. Today, as Harry said, I'm going to be talking a little bit about The Burnt City. The book Harry mentioned, Punchdrunk on the Classics, came out a little bit early in December. I'm assuming because it's such a recent publication that hopefully none of you, or not too many of you, have yet read it, because the paper that I'm going to be giving today is drawing from a particular chapter of that book, chapter 3, in which I do something of a rehearsal study of the production. So hopefully this will whet your appetite and get you interested in reading the rest of the book. And if you have already looked at the book, let me know afterwards, because I'd love to hear what you think of it. So British theatre company Punchdrunk's announcement that in 2022, they would stage an immersive production titled The Burnt City in 2 former munitions factories in London's Royal Arsenal generated enormous press buzz. The company, established in 2000, regarded as one of the founders of immersive theatre within the UK, and they've pioneered a trademark style of participatory performance where masked audience members are incorporated. Oh, and I just realized I haven't started the slideshow properly. There we go. Where masked audience members are incorporated into the world of the performance and positioned as roaming participants whose own actions and tactile engagement with the set dictates their version of the production's narrative and its meaning. Now, Punchdrunk's work is actually very varied. It's not just these large masked shows. It also encompasses commercial collaborations and television, such as what you can see on the slide here, digital gaming and education work. The one you can see on the slide here was a production for school students. It encompasses intimate performances for just 1 or 2 spectators. And it really is, however, those large-scale dance-based shows for which they're most famous. Despite being London-based and having continuously running productions of their Macbeth-inspired Sleep No More, playing in New York since 2011 and Shanghai since 2016, Punchdrunk had not opened a major production for local audiences since 2013. And the Burnt City press release made clear that Punchdrunk's long-awaited production would not only be eagerly received by their ardent community of fans, but by classicists as well, proclaiming that in the smouldering promise of the fall of Troy, a mythical world of gods and mortals rises from the ashes. The Burnt City, which, next slide, oh, I'm a bit stuck, there we go. The Burnt City, which opened in April 2022 and played until September of last year, was directed by Punchdrunk's artistic director Felix Barrett and their resident choreographer Maxine Doyle, so they co-directed it. And it primarily drew upon, amongst many other texts, Aeschylus' Agamemnon, and specifically the Ted Hughes translation, and Euripides' Hecuba. No specific translation of the Hecuba. Following the press release, Lynn Gardner wrote that the company's return to London is likely to remind why they are still leaders of the pack, with work whose complexity, scale, and attention to detail remains unparalleled, while Chris Wiegand of The Guardian whet his readers' appetites by noting that their future noir retelling of the fall of Troy would be the company's costliest and most ambitious project to date. As the April 2022 opening night approached, more press kind of continued to build up excitement and drip-fed readers clues about this production, which would have palimpsests of different layers of antiquity, not just Agamemnon and Hecuba, but also things to do with the underworld. So what we have is a production which was a long-awaited return to London for the company. Given its duration, I think we can say it's a production which is kind of substantial cultural significance. And for our purposes today, given I'm going to be talking about it as a kind of classical performance reception, I do think that it's something that's positioned as a really kind of defining piece of classical performance reception, so a performance that's based on or adapted from a classic text within 2020's British theatre. I think you'd be really hard-pressed to find a single adaptation of a classic text that plays for so long and to so many audience members, particularly since World War II. Now, the production, as Harry said, is one that I was fortunate to be involved in. So I worked as the dramaturg on the production as part of a knowledge exchange relationship with the company. So what this meant is that I provided dramaturgical assistance and research for the company, not only on the two Greek tragedies, but also on a wider range of sources relating to the Trojan War, to Greek mythology and Greek religion. And in exchange, I had access to, via kind of in-person secondments, to the R&D and rehearsal periods of the Burnt City. And during this period, I was completing research on how to turn Greek literature into immersive experience. So parts of this fed into the monograph, Punchdrunk on the Classics, but then I've also got an edited collection, which hopefully will be out later this year, towards the end of the year, which is on kind of antiquity and immersivity. What I want to talk about today is the insights that I gained from my experiences on secondment to the company through using a research methodology, which is an autoethnographic approach known as Spectator-Participation-as-Research, or SPA. SPA has flourished as a methodology within theatre studies since the early 2010s for the analysis of audience experience within participatory performance, and particularly within immersive and one-on-one forms of theatre. It combines first-person phenomenological-based accounts with more traditional scholarly analysis to replicate the author's role within and in relation to a performance. So how you can be kind of simultaneously a participant inside the work, a spectator to your own experience, and an analyst reflecting on it in the aftermath of the performance. And if you're interested in SPA, I can give you references to some of the literature that discusses the theory. Now, utilising SPA for a rehearsal study is quite unusual. Rehearsal studies usually employ the kind of traditional ethnographic methodology of participant observer, but where you're really a kind of fly on the wall participant. You're not really engaging as much. You're kind of embedded in the community, but you're there to watch it. But SPA offers a viable alternative for instances such as my own, where you're also a member of the creative team. And it's precisely because it values that kind of dual position of someone who's simultaneously an observer and a co-creator within an artistic environment. So just as an audience member in a one-on-one performance is kind of the precondition for the performance happening, in the rehearsal study, SPA kind of embraces that fact that you've got that dual positionality. For today's paper, I'm going to draw upon a SPA methodology to highlight some of the key moments of the development process behind The Burnt City, up to and including the commencement of preview performances. This is going to involve insights into how my conversations with the choreographer during the R&D phase manifested into actual scenes in the final performance, how my work with performers in one-on-one scenes added a range of other literary intertexts into the world of the performance, and then how the choreography in the finale was shaped by and adjusted once the audience was injected into the space. Through thick descriptions of these three illustrative examples, what I'm hoping to do today is to give you insight into how a work of the scale and scope of The Burnt City actually gets put together. And then what I want to do towards the end of the paper is to try and theorize this process. And I'm going to suggest that the company's process of braiding together multiple strands of material during the R&D phase, the research and development phase, and the rehearsal period equated to a form of contemporary mythopoiesis, or myth-making. The range of intertexts woven into The Burnt City resulted, I'm going to suggest, in a work of such complexity that the final production became its own megatext, featuring interconnecting vast narratives and facilitating, or at least having the potential to facilitate, the kind of fandom that is associated with other forms of contemporary mythopoiesis. And understanding the process of myth-making that lies behind The Burnt City's composition informs an understanding of the final performance, and as well as how audiences can experience or could experience it, and academics might study such a production. So that's where we're going today. Before I dive into the rehearsal room, I'm going to say just a tiny bit about the performance style of The Burnt City for anyone unfamiliar with it. I'm sure a lot of you know what the basics of Punchdrunk's theatrical practice is and kind of immersive theatre in general, but I'll just touch upon The Burnt City specifically quite briefly. So The Burnt City is emblematic of Punchdrunk's now trademark large-scale performance style, which utilises a looping narrative structure. So in this instance, it involved 11 5-minute scenes, which played through scenes 1 to 11 on a loop 3 times. So it's like a movie replaying 3 times. A concluding finale then brought the audience together and facilitated their exit from the space. During the performance, the free-flow promenade audience here could explore these 2 Woolwich warehouses at their leisure. And the warehouses featured, as you can see on the slide here, really exceptionally detailed sets. Punchdrunk used the phrase touch reel, so everything you can touch in the set, it's all fashioned to be kind of like you're touching real handwritten notes, for example. So they spend a lot of time crafting the sets in exceptional detail. The 2 warehouses represented Troy and Greek Mycenae, so the 2 opposing sides of the Trojan War. And Troy was designed as a really cosmopolitan city. It was a really labyrinthine space, whereas Greek Mycenae was cavernous. It was a large space with a really central area and then a mezzanine up the top. The square footage of the 2 spaces was 100,000 square feet. So we're talking about a massive amount of space that audiences could roam around, and they were connected by a purpose-built link structure. The cast was made up of 28 performers, and these 28 were split between what Punchdrunk termed traveling characters, and these are dance-based characters, primarily drawn from the 2 Greek tragedies, and resident characters, which co-director Barrett refers to as kind of heartbeats of the space. And the residents are drawn from a broader range of intertexts, and they're there to kind of add depth to the narrative universe. And in reality, the performers often had a role within each, a traveling and a resident role, and they would alternate to kind of have a rest from those very exhausting dance pieces. With only a few notable exceptions, the full cast of 28 characters were what we might term on stage for every moment of the performance. So in the first scene of The Burnt City, for example, there was performance taking place in 16 separate areas of the set. So witnessing all the action was completely impossible in one or even several viewings of the performance. And part of the sell of this style of immersive theatre is that each audience member would have a different experience based upon which areas of the set they chose to explore or which performers they decided to follow and watch. Now, having the performing company on stage for the entire loop requires substantial poetic license. So if we look at the source tragedies that Punchdrunk are borrowing from, for example, Hecuba starts with the ghost of Polydorus, and he's there for that opening monologue, and he's not seen again for the rest of the play. But for Punchdrunk, Polydorus has to be on stage for the entire performance. The reverse, Agamemnon, has a character, Aegisthus, appear for the Exodus. He's there as Clytemnestra's lover, and they've just killed her husband, Agamemnon, and he's only appearing in that final scene. And again, Punchdrunk need to find a full narrative for this character. So one of the primary tasks during the research and development stage for the Burnt City was to construct what Punchdrunk term the loop chart. And this begins the process of mapping out each character's journey and filling in all the gaps in their narrative as contained in the primary source texts. And what we were then doing in the R&D period is trying to interpolate additional narrative content. We were also aiming to construct brief treatments, so kind of short paragraphs explaining the setting and the concept of a scene, all of which were then passed on to performers at the start of rehearsals. So I want to turn now to my first example from the production's R&D phase to explore how the creative team goes about filling in the loop chart. And I'm going to take you back here to the 3rd of March, 2020, so immediately pre-lockdown, to when I was working with Barrett and Doyle on a 4-week period of creative development. And during this period, we were busy creating A2 size biographies for each of the characters currently envisaged for the Burnt City. And each kind of A2 page had all these A4 documents stapled to it, featuring background information, timelines, family trees, and possible storylines. So again, just like the post-it notes, we're workshopping it in a very kind of physical way. Now, Doyle in particular, so the co-director and the choreographer, had a really keen interest in drilling down into the content that we could use to flesh each character out. And during this period, Barrett was more interested in attending to the bigger picture material. So he would kind of spend a bit of time with the choreographer, Maxine Doyle, and myself, and then kind of go and spend time with the sound designers and the set designers. Doyle's interests during this period ranged from the tragic source texts through to much more obscure cult associations. And she jumped at the chance to document ideas for multi-scene journeys for characters that were still awaiting content for their loop. So the idea was to try and find an origin point for every bit of the loop rather than to create the stories ourselves to try and interpolate things from other sources. Iphigenia in particular required a substantial amount of narrative content at this stage, as the only material relating to her from the source text actually didn't even put her on stage at all. So in Agamemnon, Iphigenia features in a flashback. We have a choraloid which describes at the beginning of the Trojan War how Agamemnon sacrifices her. And we have the sacrifice at this stage in March 2020, mooted for scene 4, a potential wedding breakfast mooted for scene 3. And on the slide here, we've got the wedding breakfast scene. This is Iphigenia dancing with Aegisthus, her uncle, the character that I mentioned before that only appears in the Exodus. And this wedding breakfast is in a nod to another Greek tragedy, Iphigenia at Aulis, where a marriage is used as a kind of ruse to get Iphigenia to where she's going to be sacrificed. We also have a potential scene involving her kind of metamorphosing into a deer for scene 5. And this is from a 3rd Greek tragedy, Iphigenia among the Taurians, where at the moment of her sacrifice, Artemis intervenes and transforms her into a deer. So we have 3 possible scenes out of 11 that we've drawn from source tragedies, and an awful lot still to go to fill. When we got to rehearsals, Doyle stressed the significance of Iphigenia and Clytemnestra's early scenes to the performers, saying that, quote, "We have 15 minutes to establish the relationship between Clytemnestra and Iphigenia. It isn't long, but we need that time to count to give Clytemnestra's revenge weight," end quote. Now, the origin of ensuring that those early scenes had enough weight was in March 2022, during my discussions with Doyle about Iphigenia's wider mythology, when Doyle became interested by my mention of Iphigenia's association with the sanctuary of Artemis Brauronia in Attica, which another Greek tragedy records the establishment of. And during this period, Maxine and I went back and forth discussing all the different references to this sanctuary and this pentateuch festival, the Brauronia, that took place at this sanctuary. And this festival involved Athenian girls between the ages of 5 and 10 completing a maturation rite in preparation for marriage and to mark the transition from Parthenos to Gune, from girl to woman. And we looked at a whole host of different texts, both literary texts and pieces of material culture, which showed excerpts or talked about this festival. And we had a couple of really interesting examples. There's a throwaway line in a comedy by Aristophanes, the Lysistrata, which describes being a bear at the Brauronia. And we've also got some pottery fragments which show young girls dancing and also bears dancing and perhaps running as well. So we've got a reference to this sanctuary in a play about Iphigenia, and then other sources that we're borrowing from which talk about what might have happened at this festival. Now, the way that we use this material is really indicative of how we created the narrative, how we filled out the loop chart. So there is no unity in all the different sources we have about this festival. We've got lots of contradictions. So the fragments that we have, the pottery fragments, some of them seem to show slow dancing, some seem to show fast dancing. Nothing seems to kind of come together to give us something from which we could try and do something that's historically realistic. But that's not really Doyle's objective anyway. So she wasn't interested in creating a reconstruction of historical material, but she wanted to springboard out of ideas. And for her, the fit between the Brauronia as a marriage preparation rite and then Iphigenia's status as betrothed during the first scenes of the production provided an opportunity to incorporate reference to ancient cult activity and dance in ritual worship as part of Iphigenia's loop, and to layer historical notes into the production. It's not expected that a lot of audience members are going to be getting these historical references. The idea is to create something that stands by itself, but the creatives have these roots in proper sources. These discussions all manifested in the production's first two scenes. So in Iphigenia's scene 1, we had a preparation scene in her bedroom, where together with Clytemnestra and an oracle, Iphigenia prepared for a ritual by practicing a slow and solemn dance. The idea is that Clytemnestra would have gone to this ritual, would have done the dance as a girl, and she was now kind of handing over the choreography to her daughter, getting her ready to participate in the ritual. And then we had in scene 2, the two women journeying together to the shrine to Artemis, where Clytemnestra poured a libation and Iphigenia danced hypnotically in a full-length bear costume for her second scene. So this first example shows how Doyle and I began filling in Iphigenia's loop, and it demonstrates the type of preparation that was undertaken at the commencement of rehearsals. If we fast forward almost 2 years to February 2022, when we're in rehearsals, we see how the performers then responded to this type of material. So in February 2022, Punchdrunk had commenced their standard schedule for on-site rehearsals. So the production was rehearsed in situ in the Woolwich venues. The standard schedule was that everyone would gather in the rehearsal room each morning for a 1-hour warm-up before then moving into that performance space and devising the scenes in situ for the remainder of the day. Initially, the company worked on one scene per day, going sequentially from scene 1 to 5. And the space was constantly a real hive of activity. So we'd have the full ensemble rehearsing, as well as the set actually being constructed around us as we worked. And to give you a sense of the numbers, the performing company alone was about 50. And we had 2 casts, a red and a blue cast. And I mentioned before, most performers had a role as a resident and a traveller. So everyone was learning or co-creating multiple roles. And we also had an ensemble of swings who would be preparing to kind of swing in as understudies should someone get injured or be on a period of leave. The objective each day was to push out a sketch for each scene. And once we got to the end of scene 5, we recapped 2 scenes a day, recapped 2 scenes a day, we then ran half the show, and then we repeated the whole process to create the remainder of the show. That's kind of how, once we got to rehearsals, how things happened on a very kind of macro scale. If we zoom into the micro scale, on one of these days during the rehearsal window, I was called in to work with Andrea Carucciu, who you saw on the previous slide here as Aegisthus. So this is Andrea that I'm talking about. But for this particular rehearsal, he was called in to work on the character of Ascalaphus, who you can see pictured here. This is Jordan Ajari, who is playing Ascalaphus in this photo call. Now, I mentioned before that resident roles are roles that Barrett described as heartbeats of the space. They're often drawn from collision sources, which mean from not the Greek tragedies, but from other sources. And they bring for Barrett depth to the narrative universe and the electricity that makes the show crackle. They get their name resident from the fact that they're usually resident in quite small areas of the set, where they can be found throughout the entire loop. Within Greece, there were only 2 resident characters, an oracle and a watchman stationed at the border, while in Troy, which was much more of an urban metropolis, we had a really large group of residents outside of the royal house of Priam. And Ascalaphus was one of these Trojan residents. In terms of collision sources, the name Ascalaphus links to the underworld, the Greek mythological underworld. So Ascalaphus is famous. He's the guardian of Hades' orchard, but he's famous because he reveals to Zeus that Persephone had eaten pomegranate seeds in the underworld. And thus this kind of revelation damns Persephone to spend part of the year in the underworld each year. Now, Ascalaphus's loop didn't revolve around that underworld narrative or that kind of whistleblowing story about telling Zeus about Persephone eating those seeds. He was a resident of Troy. He owned a fake flower florist, which was a kind of nod to his role as a guardian of an orchard. But he had a one-on-one. And it was this one-on-one scene, which was an exception to this broader rule about him being a resident character that didn't respond to those sources. And the one-on-one did tell the story of his whistleblowing. Now, one-on-one experiences are a signature of Felix Barrett's work, and they involve performers in these large-scale masked shows, selecting a single spectator from the audience and inviting them into a private part of the set to witness a scene that's just performed for them alone. The scenes are really tightly structured parts of a character's loop. However, during the scenes, the kind of standard rules of a Punchdrunk performance are temporarily suspended. So the audience member's mask, which you can see the spectators wearing in this image on the slide, this is removed. Sometimes the audience member might be invited to talk. Usually you can't take things away from the Punchdrunk set, but often in one-on-ones you might be given something that you can take with you, a charm, a necklace, or something like that. The scene with Ascalaphus, as I said, tied into his whistleblowing narrative, and it did subvert some of these rules that you usually see in the rest of the performance. The creative team had decided ahead of the February 2022 rehearsals to use Ascalaphus's one-on-one experience to touch upon the character's mythology and to use text. So a lot of the scenes in the Burnt City responded to text, but they didn't often interrogate text very closely. The performers often were not working with text in their hands when they were choreographing scenes and whatnot. But the Ascalaphus scene was an exception to this. It was text-based, and the characters, or the performers rather, workshopped the scene through Ovid's description in the Metamorphoses of Ascalaphus's whistleblowing and what happens next, which is that Demeter transforms him into an owl. Demeter is Persephone's mother, if you don't know your Greek mythology. Now, the specific rehearsal that I want to zoom you into commences with Andrea, myself, and rehearsal director Eric Jackson Bradley. Rehearsal directors are a bit like assistant directors in dance-based practice. And we commence this rehearsal by visiting the one-on-one room. So again, we're talking about devising something in situ. And this one-on-one room was the back room in Ascalaphus's shop. So his fake florist shop, and it had been designed as a space where he dyes flowers. As I said earlier, Punchdrunk's designs are touch real with a really filmic level of detail. So in this space, we had fake flowers hanging from the roof, drying, buckets of ready-made flowers, dyes, and feathers all placed on the floor, and they're tools at the performer's disposal to create a scene. We also have some costume to work with in this rehearsal, which included a moth-holed vest with fake skin beneath a hole, which after some scratching, Ascalaphus would pull out some feathers in a kind of black swan-esque moment and a nod to that transformation into an owl. Now, this state of play is really very typical for how scenes were created in the Burnt City rehearsal period. There was an idea or a concept for a scene, in exactly the same way as there was that nod to the Browronia that was decided upon in the R&D phase, which was handed over to the Iphigenia character. So this is predetermined. We have some set and costume design in progress. So the performer has ample material to work with, but still the opportunity to feed back to the designers, request alterations and additions, etc. But what we have is the performer then creating the actual material, which can include the choreography, the audience interaction, and the specific beats of narrative and story, which they will workshop themselves and in collaboration with the creative team and their fellow performers. So to give you a little bit more of a sense of what this looked like in practice, with Andrea's creation of the one-on-one scene for Ascalaphus, we start off by interrogating Ovid's text, mining it for language that can be translated into physicality. So it's almost like a form of translation. Caruccio and the rehearsal director, Jackson Bradley, were particularly interested in the disturbing quality of Ovid's description of the transformation. And so they wished to play with this imagery in the text, describing the owl as a vile creature rather than something associated with wisdom, and imagery like nails bending inwards and arms being immobilized. Having parsed the text and selected imagery, we all then moved into the space to look at the props at our disposal and to play with some ideas. The room we were in had two entrances, one from within the flower shop and one from what was called Trash Can Alley in the set. This was the back streets of Troy. And this design facilitated the audience members' entrance and exit from two different locations. And the design was a really kind of perfect illustration of Punchdrunk's design ethos, which always tries to preserve the mystery of a space by not letting you see everything from a doorway. So you have to kind of walk in and turn a corner in order to be able to see the space. Caruccio and Jackson Bradley were immediately interested in the idea of Ascalaphus getting wet. And this is a nod to how Demeter turns him into an owl. So she flings liquid lava at him from the river Phlegethon. And so they started playing with the props in the set, thinking about how Caruccio could sit underneath a keg that might drip water, potentially hide kind of a manual device within the room's benches, which might kind of manually feed through and drip onto him, or potentially by utilizing the faux flowers that were going to be in this space. So maybe he could hold a dripping flower over his head or have an audience dunk the flower and peg it up on the roof to dry, and it then drips on his head. To actually build the action, the performer worked with a soundscape, and the sound was not designed bespoke for the scene, but rather there was a series of kind of almost blank canvases of sound design, which could be used in different one-on-ones. So a lot of Punchdrunk sound is kind of pastiched from lots of different samples. And so the performer and the rehearsal director had a range of different tracks that they could choose from. This gave them a bit of a say in the oral texture of the environment. Having chosen one of the tracks, Caruccio improvised material around the music, using the space, props, and costume, walking through the beats of leading someone in, removing their mask, doing some business with the flowers, dripping water, scratching, and revealing the feather. Creating the scene was thus a dance between Ovid's text, the intricate design of the space, the storytelling facilitated by the sound design, and the emotional colour and physical interpretation of Caruccio, which from this rehearsal onwards went on to be honed in collaboration with the other directors and the performers who shared the role of Ascalaphus. Although the narrative arc of the scene and the core imagery of the dripping water rather, and the feather reveal remained the same right up until the performance opened, this moment of rehearsal just scratched the surface of what it took to create the scene. What was clear from this moment of rehearsal alone, however, was that one-on-ones within the Burnt City involved excavating language, both for an overarching narrative reveal and for small-scale details that can add colour and dynamism to the scene. So these two examples have shown how ideas were generated for fleshing out the loop chart for the burnt city, and then how performers work to devise actual material around these ideas. For my final example, I want to show you how material changed during the rehearsal and preview periods to demonstrate the significance of process to the final product, and to show how not only do Punchdrunk bring a multitude of source texts and performance strategies into play when they're creating a performance, but how they also tailor and adapt these to the reality of a mobile audience. So we're now going to journey forward to the 10th of March 2022, just a week prior to the first invited audience arriving for a sneak peek dress rehearsal, when the creative team's attention turned to the finale. Now, a large-scale finale has been a core structural component of all Punchdrunk masked performances since the company's 2003 Sleep No More. Instigated at the suggestion of Doyle, the finale usually brings together the entire audience for a central large-scale scene, which provides a definitive conclusion to the performance, and then helps transition spectators out of their immersive world in much the same way as the crossfade facilitates their entry. For the Burnt City, the concept of the finale was set during the R&D development phase of the project. After scene 11, the action of which includes the murder of Agamemnon in Greece and then the blinding of Polymestor in Troy, the entire cast was then planned to come together on the grand staircase which links the mezzanine to the ground floor in Greece. The director's idea for the scene was to springboard out of the Trojan War narrative, to make a broader statement about the impact of war, and perhaps to even clarify for the audience that the characters are all in the underworld. So this is the kind of deepest layer of the performance. It's an explanation for the fact that it's looping, kind of underplaying all the loop was this idea that Hades, who is a character in the play, even though he's not in the source text, Hades is kind of retelling the story of the fall of Troy on a loop. And Hades and Persephone didn't loop. That was a kind of code that audiences could crack in the performance. So their narrative lasted for the full duration of the performance. Now, we drew on two key texts to create this finale. Firstly, a Hans Memling painting of man falling into hell. And secondly, Cherubini's Requiem in C minor, so a piece of music. Despite all of this background information being known in advance of the March rehearsal, it would be a mistake to assume that the scene was near completion, with how the cast transitioned from their final scene of the loop into the finale not known, and the actual movement of the performance for this kind of fall of man sequence outstanding. So the task for this rehearsal on the 10th of March was to create this material, to address the gap surrounding what was known as the stair sequence. And the images that you can see on the slide here were from before rehearsal started. These were publicity images, but they were kind of part of the inspiration for the final sequence. And you can kind of see the relationship between the performers who are in situ, they're at that staircase, and then the Memling image that you can see on the slide here. Although Punchdrunk's rehearsals often involve a large degree of performer autonomy, the stair sequence rehearsal had a really strong directorial presence, given the specificity of the vision attached to the scene and the large number of bodies involved in bringing the vision to life. So for this rehearsal, we had both co-directors, we also had two rehearsal directors, and the cast there. And one of the rehearsal directors, Kath Duggan, initiated this rehearsal with the instruction that today they would attempt, quote, to find more thickness in the finale, in the movement, dig in, progress it forward, end quote. The image of the Memling painting was circulated to the cast, with Barrett explaining that the audience would see the image as they entered the performance and could also find it hanging in Hades' home within the set. Barrett also announced that he was working with the lighting designer around the idea of building flashes or strobes into the finale so that, quote, we see the image come to life as freeze frames or seared into the retinas, with Doyle also offering the clarification that we're not reconstructing the image, but that the audience should get the feeling or the sensation of the image. Before commencing work on the stairs, the directors also gave the final instruction that apart from the two queens, Hecuba and Clytemnestra, the rest of the cast should shift away from their character, leave it at the top of the stairs, Maxine said, and were instead now leftovers of mankind frantically trying to escape damnation. The task was set as to create a grieving, mourning ritual rather than a linear narrative, with Doyle offering the final direction that the sequence is more of an existential piece on the impact of conflict and grief. We started the rehearsal with an initial cast of performers moving to the top of the staircase. The director's first task was to try and determine how many bodies were needed on the stairs to give the sequence the necessary gravitas for a finale. Doyle started with an initial 12 bodies spaced at different intervals across the staircase before playing the scene's sound design on a portable speaker. The soundscape included 9 dull sirens intermixed with a gong, but despite the abstractness of this soundscape, Doyle and Duggan clarified to the cast that the sequence couldn't be improvised, but would consist of very precise choreography leading up to the point where that cherubini sequence started. Doyle stopped and started this siren composition, spacing out the bodies as they started their stair descent. The movement language, already solidified through the early workshops and the daily hour-long warm-ups, meant that a gestural language of a kind of lyrical slow-motion descent came innately to the performers. Directorial notes were consequently about really specific tweaks to physicality, including position your face more so we can see it, think about the angle of your arm, incline back further, carry your shape more rather than move through. At one point, to add another dimension to the finale, Doyle suggested that the performers playing Cassandra enter the stair descent as a final figure and try a stair solo already choreographed for a different scene. The more frantic staccato movements of the Cassandra solo contrasted with the stillness and the tension and torsion of the descending characters, and was a juxtaposition retained for the final performance. With the specific angle and positioning of each performer set, the directors then began to add in notes about the way the group moved together, such as, when Harry does his drop, we need to feel that ricochet through the group a little. To my observing eye, the note seemed so specific that running the scene and witnessing a fluid choreographic echo of the painting felt impossible. But yet that is precisely what occurred, with the performers on Doyle's cue running the full scene and then handing over the detail of their descent to the other cast. It seemed that in one 90-minute rehearsal, this stair sequence quickly came together and the finale edged substantially closer to completion. However, the end of the Burnt City was still a way from being finished, with a lot of other aesthetic decisions still pending. So we needed finale costumes, lighting design, there was the possibility of an ash drop, and a finessing of the choreography once that cherubini music started. Additional hours of rehearsal over the next 2 weeks solved most of these outstanding queries, but the idea of the scene reaching completion remained a complete fantasy until after the arrival of the audience and the adjustment of the scene in response to their presence. The audience first entered the space for the Burnt City on the 17th and 19th of March 2022 for 2 sneak peek dress rehearsals for invited guests. So these are largely kind of friends and family of really everyone that was involved in the production, from the performers right through to the carpenters and the painters who were helping build the show. Even with a reduced audience size, issues to do with how the performers moved through the space around the audience to arrive in time for their scenes were immediately apparent, and this is particularly the case for the finale. So we had some performers who were coming from Troy, and in particular Polymester, who was going from being blinded at the end of scene 11, really struggling to reach the finale in time. And we had a lot of audience kind of standing around waiting at the bottom of the staircase for something to happen. When something did start happening, we also had real sightline problems, even with a smaller number of audience. So if you were standing at the bottom of the staircase, you would be able to see the descent sequence, but then when the performers reached the bottom and had choreography in the main space downstairs, it was impossible to see that. And similarly, it was the kind of flip side. If you were away from the stairs, you might not be able to see what was going on there, but you would be able to see the ground. So you only had kind of 50% of the experience. We also had an enormous bottleneck. So we had this instance where we had an enormous number of audience coming together and then they couldn't exit from the space. And it was meaning that the performance would kind of end on a bit of a sour note, with you standing around trying to get out and being kind of stuck in this central space after the lights have come back on. So clearly we had something that was unworkable. During the morning notes session, which kickstarted rehearsals on the 23rd of March, 2022, Barrett and Doyle informed the cast that this finale would need to be changed. And instead we would have two finales, with one taking place in the Trojan town square to weave in the requirements surrounding audience flow and visibility and to share the audience across two warehouses. A Trojan finale had been raised as a possibility early on in the creative development of the Burnt City. So we do have practical constraints governing the decision here, but it's not entirely in opposition to the director's creative vision. The concept that Barrett and Doyle presented was for a version of the climax of Euripides' Hecuba as the Trojan finale, which was relocated to the town square with additional characters to heighten the scale of the scene and the degree of spectacle. The image of the two queens coming together in Mycenae to conclude the performance was removed, and instead we had mirror images of the two scenes occurring in the two different warehouses, with Hecuba staying in the town square where she would look up to an ash drop as the exact same extract from Cherubini's Requiem played. So just like there were 16 scenes going on in scene one, or 16 bits of action taking place in scene one, and you would never be able to see all of that. Again, we've got this sense where you could never see both of them in one performance, but maybe you'd find people that you went to the performance with in the bar afterwards, and you could realize that you had two totally different experiences of the finale. The addition of this second finale involved performers losing material and creating it. So we had some cast members who had helped create the stair descent sequence, then getting moved into Troy, having to hand over their choreography to other performers in service of the bigger picture. When the second preview took place on the 25th of March, we had not only the addition of a new finale, but new cast members performing parts of the original finale. And performers had as little as 30 minutes to rehearse these new scenes with the lighting design. And this shows just how alive, pressured, and precious the rehearsal period was during Punchdrunk's preview process, and the efficiency required to rehearse the essentials once we understood audience flow in the available time. During previews, the audience became the final source of meaning in the Burnt City, generating and shaping content and becoming an active player within the space of the performance. Their impact as a collective entity upon the conclusion shows that they might be the last factor, but they are by no means the least important, with the wider structures of performance and the tracks of each character all bending to accommodate the audience's needs. In previews, the audience became just as alive a presence within the rehearsal process as the tragedies of Aeschylus and Euripides. So, to conclude, through these three deep dives into my access and involvement into the research, development, and rehearsal process of Punchdrunk's Burnt City, I have today tried to scratch the surface of how Punchdrunk developed their show. The artists engaged not only with Agamemnon and Hecuba for the travelling characters' loops, but also with a range of other collision sources, such as Ovid's Metamorphoses and Hans Memling's Fall of Man, as well as evidence of Greek religion and cult activities such as the Brauronia. These sources were combined with strands of meaning that would make up the identity of the performance, such as the specific choreographic vocabulary and the presence of a mobile audience. In the time I've had today, I've shared evidence that's far more partial than it could have been. So a similar level of creative license to that used when creating the role of Iphigenia was required when creating the travelling characters of Aegisthus, Polydorus, Neoptolemus, and Polyxena, all of whom make just one appearance in their source texts. So my discussions with Doyle provided the basis of two of Iphigenia's missing scenes, and my work with Caruccio provided the basis of his one-on-one experience. You can imagine the enormous range of material that's required to create the full loop of 28 characters in this performance. When it came to the actual devising of the Burnt City, no one factor, whether that be the historical source, the movement vocabulary, or the realities of performing for a mobile audience, trumped the other. Entire scenes were built around and removed due to any one of these components. The different nodes within the rehearsal process thus became individual threads within the braid of the Burnt City, creating a reception of Greek tragedy of unusual complexity, in that it was not a reception of even a conglomeration of tragedies, but of a far more disparate assemblage of sources. Today, I want to conclude this overview by suggesting that the scale and scope of the final production ultimately had less in common with other adaptations of Agamemnon and Hecuba, or the revisionist retellings of mythology that we find in wider popular culture, and more in common with the megatexts that we find in the fantasy worlds of Tolkien or C.S. Lewis, or in the Marvel and DC megaverses. Given the number of simultaneous narratives unfolding at tangents from one another, the sizable cast of characters, and the ability for the production to create its own community of superfans who engage in the form of fan fiction known as extended audiencing. If Punchdrunk's Burnt City is more like the secondary story worlds in the above-mentioned texts than it is like its contemporaneous classical adaptations, then it follows that its creation, as described today, is an example of contemporary mythopoiesis. A production becomes both an example of a classical reception and mythopoiesis when it's not simply a new version of a piece of mythology, or to use Sarah Iles Johnson's terminology, another serial of the hyper-serialized narrative that is the megatext of Greek mythology. But rather, it needs to use myth, as Neil Gaiman describes, as compost to provide fertile ground for the blossoming of a host of other tales. Although the central spine of the Burnt City was known narrative, even if we consider the classical content of the production in isolation, we find that the production originates entirely new tales, such as those of residents such as Ascalaphus, or the travelling gods in the play who don't appear in the Greek tragedies. And I haven't had time to talk about those gods today, but two of them, Hades and Persephone, were actually inspired by the myth of Bluebeard. The end result of the Burnt City was an example of Iles Johnson's coherent and credible story world, which not only tells multiple stories, but involves the creation of paratextual materials by its fan base, facilitates spin-offs, is separated from the primary world by a distinct boundary, and has its own unique logic, including here the masked and unmasked status of audience versus performers, or the looping purgatorial narrative structure. Barrett and Doyle commented in the press, to the press rather, in their pre-publicity that they understood their project is about mining the density and richness of Greek tragedy. The snapshot insight into Punchdrunk's rehearsals that I've given to you today indicates that in conceptualizing their practice in such a way, the directors actually sold their project short. The Burnt City does mine, to use Barrett and Doyle's perhaps problematic words, the bedrock of Western theatre, but by studying the processes involved in the R&D and rehearsal periods, we can see that it involves combining this material with a bespoke mix of additional ingredients to create a new narrative universe fit for original immersive performance. Studying how process shapes product reveals that the Burnt City was created via a form of contemporary mythopoiesis. And if we want to contemplate ways of facilitating immersion across time, genre, and medium, then creating a narrative universe through these contemporary myth-making strategies, if Punchdrunk are anything to go by, might be a way in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma. Really brilliant and great to hear the kind of level of detail with which your role kind of formed part of the process as well. So we've got time for questions for Q&A. I'd be happy to invite people to raise their hand and ask their question in person, or if you'd rather, you can type your question in the chat, and I'll just make sure to keep an eye on that so that if there's questions, we can kind of cover those as well. I just think it's really great. I'll start off just to like let people think of a question maybe. And also it's kind of chair's privilege, isn't it, in a way? But just to reflect a little bit, I think it's really fascinating to get that level of insight into the rehearsal process. It feels quite unique to me, particularly for a company like Punchdrunk. And what an amazing opportunity, but also, I mean, you talked about it as, yeah, this kind of access? Who else has that access and can sort of really gain that insight into the company? So thank you for kind of sharing that, because it's really great to hear more about it, and particularly how close I think their work can be to a kind of devising process, and how involved the performers are in that process of making, I think is really interesting as well. Um, I have like a few like questions forming in my head, but maybe I'll just pick one. Um, I think it's what I found really interesting. One thing I found really interesting is how much kind of in-depth research and kind of story mapping has gone into each, say, 5-minute scene. And I didn't see the Burnt City, but my guess is that that adds real kind of depth and texture to the material itself and the images that are created. But of course, the audience themselves uh, may not grasp the whole kind of story or narratives that the company are drawing on. So it can maybe be quite fragmented, or as you said, drawing on a lot of sources. What do you think that kind of, I mean, you've talked about this, but I wonder if you could expand a little bit on what you think that kind of distilling of many stories and many narratives and many texts into these kind of quite short looping uh, moments of performance. What kind of texture does that have for the audience, do you think? That's my question.
Thanks, Harry. Yes, lots to touch upon with what you've just said. And your comment about how close it is to devising actually was one of the big things that, or not close, how close it is devised performance. And that was one of the big things that I was surprised by. I kind of went into that process thinking that it was going to be fully directed. And I'd never been involved in my prior dramaturgy work with dance-based practice. And so my understanding of how choreography gets taught was based on movies. And it's not like that. It's not with a choreographer standing in front of a group. It's the choreographer creating a vocabulary and then the performers choreographing the content. But I digress. So in terms of all of the source material, you're absolutely right that it's not grasped by audiences necessarily. And I wear so many different hats with this particular role, because there's my kind of classicist hat, where kind of what I want more than anything else is for 1 out of 600 audience members to have been intrigued by something and then to go away and plug into Google Iphigenia bear or Artemis bear, and to find this historical source about how people would potentially dress up as in bear costumes at this ritual. So I kind of feel with my classicist hat on that if, a tiny fragment of the audience gets a reference or looks up a reference, that I've done some educating there. So that's my kind of selfish academic answer there. But in terms of the kind of disorientation of the experience and not getting the references, Punchdrunk have to tread this really difficult line there. So what they do in all of their performances is they fragment narrative, they atomize narrative around the space. So even without having these kind of hundreds and hundreds of different sources that they're injecting into every scene, into every character, what they're trying to do is to create this kind of disorientation where you lose linearity, and you have to kind of discover things for yourself in ways that don't make sense. You can't kind of put that neat jigsaw puzzle together. Their most recent, before the Burnt City London production, The Drowned Man, had some negative kind of critical feedback, would you say, from the press, in that they kind of took it too far almost. So that production was based on Wojciech. So it's a kind of fragmentary, unfinished source play that they were dealing with, and it's much more obscure than Greek mythology. So I don't know whether this was a deliberate response to people saying it was too confusing in The Drowned Man. They were doing strategies like kind of giving people a plot summary before they went in when you were queuing to enter with the Wojciech adaptation. Whether they did it kind of in response to that or not, I don't know. But here, one of the ways that they're trying to kind of potentially mitigate against it being too disorienting and fragmented is by taking something which has a little bit more kind of familiarity.
Mm.
And not everyone will have read Agamemnon or Hecuba, but Greek mythology is more familiar than Wojciech. So they were deliberately trying to give people something more of a kind of foothold into the disorientation. But it is definitely a kind of plethora of sources, and they're kind of trying to tread that line between disorientation and overwhelm, where you're dealing with atomized narrative, multiplicity of sources, but then also giving you a way in. So they're aware of it. It's a tightrope. I don't know
Yeah.
if that answers your question very well.
No, definitely. And there's, I guess, working with those texts that have many different versions in literature
Mm.
in many different languages and many different, but there is a kind of, yeah, like you say, a familiarity there that might support that process of fragmentation or disorientation. You have something to kind of cling on to, at least, like some
Yeah.
understanding.
And I suppose the other part of that is that they're primarily telling these stories or engaging with these sources through a kind of visual dramaturgy. So it's through references that are being put into the design, through the choreography and the visual performance language that the performers, primarily dancers, are injecting. So they're abstracting all of the sources that they're engaging with. And I mentioned that it was quite rare in the second and the third example, when they had the painting, and then in the second one, we had Ovid's text kind of in hand, but that was really rare. So usually all of these sources were being digested and they would get a paragraph, which was kind of the creative team's distillation of the multiplicity of sources, which was then abstractly rendered in
Mm.
performance. So it's almost like ducks on the water where you can't see all the work under the surface. It's the idea that there's a lot there, but if you're not getting all the references, you can still kind of enjoy the choreography.
Yeah. But I think, and it's the last thing I'm going to say for a bit, and I'll open up some questions. But I think that's maybe what might differentiate Punchdrunk's work from a lot of the kind of pop-up immersive experiences that have become more kind of widespread, more popular, is that level of depth and that texture and the stuff underneath the surface, rather than just thinking about a fun experience or a kind of entertaining experience. Um,
Yeah.
okay, I'm gonna open up to questions. I can see Lucy has her hand up, so I'll invite you to ask your question, Lucy, and I'll just check the chat to see if there's any more while you're doing that.
Hi. Thank you, Emma. That was great. I apologize if this is slightly specific, but I've been wanting to ask this for a while. And you were talking about familiarity and, and that as a sort of hoping to try and give people a foothold. And because of that, I wonder, because I saw The Burnt City and I noticed who wasn't there. There wasn't an Achilles character, which I thought was really interesting. And sort of some of his role in the sort of mythology went to the Neoptolemus character. And I was wondering, in this role of sort of the stuff you were talking about atomizing the narrative and fragmenting and distancing, I wondered if you could talk more about that choice, because I thought that was really interesting. Because to my mind, Achilles is sort of, we've got the Achilles heel. If you're searching for name recognition, he's, one of the names you'd keep. So I thought it was really interesting that his name was not there.
Yeah, absolutely. So this was a discussion, a live discussion in the R&D period. And actually, it's precisely what you just said, kind of Achilles heel. It's such a kind of point of recognition was the reason why there was no Achilles. So the directors decided that there was just too much baggage associated with Achilles. And because we weren't staging the part of Achilles' story where You know, there's the Achilles and Hector decisive battle before the fall of Troy. There's the Achilles death. Because we weren't staging any of that, they thought it was going to be misleading to have an Achilles there and not do that. So for the non-classicists here, the place for Achilles within the story is the betrothal of Iphigenia. So her early narrative scenes in the source texts, she's betrothed to Achilles, and that's what kind of lures her to the army's camp. She gets promised to marry Achilles. She arrives at the army camp and then gets sacrificed. And what happened in our production is Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, fulfilled that role. So she came to kind of marry Neoptolemus. And Neoptolemus in the source tragedies, so in the Hecuba, he's there at the sacrifice of Polyxena, a Trojan princess that gets sacrificed, and he's involved in that. And he was one of those characters that needed a lot of narrative to be filled out. So the way that we filled it out is we took Achilles' story and we gave it to Achilles' son, as it were. So that kind of filled out part of Neoptolemus's loop, but then it also gave this really nice twinning where we had Iphigenia being sacrificed in scene 4, and then Polyxena, I think it's scene 6, having her sacrifice, and Neoptolemus in both of them. And it let us have this through line where there's a big kind of discourse in classical scholarship about whether Homeric heroes experience post-traumatic stress disorder or combat trauma. And it's a very divisive topic, but for the purposes of the Burnt City, we kind of lent into this, and kind of Neoptolemus had these two very scarring experiences involving the death of Iphigenia and the death of Polyxena, and he ends up kind of having a form of combat trauma. So it worked dramaturgically for Neoptolemus's character to take Achilles' narrative and then to feed in for the rest of his loop. And it also meant that we didn't kind of present to the audience Achilles and then not show them anything, which we thought kind of might end up being a really frustrating experience if they're kind of following Achilles and being like, where's Hector? What's going on? So yeah, it's kind of precisely the reason you mentioned, but we didn't include him.
I can see Paul's hand, but maybe I'll just dip into the chat a little bit and then come back to Paul if that's okay. So Mahana, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, has asked, amazing journey. I wanted to know if you could point out the biggest boundary or obstacle for you in the process of creating this project.
So, I mean, I guess there's two projects for me. There's the project creatively of being dramaturg, and then there's the project with my kind of academic hat of writing the research. And really, I mean, it's possibly a two very mundane answer, but the biggest issue was COVID. So I started that R&D anecdote was 2020. And when COVID hit, I actually didn't know if the production would ever see the light of day. We had kind of sponsors pulling out and things. And if the production didn't happen, the book wouldn't happen. It was a kind of domino effect. So, I mean, that was the biggest difficulty. But actually, even if it wasn't COVID, I didn't quite realize the kind of stakes of these things and how precarious they are really until kind of the last minute often, and just how kind of quickly things can fall over. And I mean, Punchdrunk had tried to get this off the ground previously. It had a different title at that stage, and it was they got into the space and then they lost the space. So they were going to do it at a kind of former Central St. Martin's in Holborn, and yeah, they got into the space. They kind of cast the show, and then they lost the venue. And they've talked about that in the press before, so it's not a kind of exclusive that I'm sharing here. But yeah, I didn't quite realize just how kind of quickly everything can crumble, and it's really difficult when I guess for me, this was not my project, the Burnt City. I was so fortunate to be involved in it as a member of the creative team, but when things go wrong and you're seconded to a company in this kind of knowledge exchange relationship as an academic, you have no decision-making power in terms of how you're going to pivot the project or what length the delay is going to be or anything like that. So that's a real challenge that I had. And it obviously all worked out, taking 2 years plus longer than anticipated. But yeah, that's something moving forward that I'm going to be really hyper aware of, and what kind of contingency plans you can put in place, realizing that even if it's not a pandemic, actually kind of sponsors pulling out, losing the rights to a venue can mean that things just topple over. Collaborators having the right to stop something, which is also something that's happened. Like, yeah, there's a lot of kind of moving parts, and things can be really precarious in ways you don't quite realize.
Thanks, Emma. Paul, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks very much, Emma. That's the first thing I should say. It was really rich talk and great to hear. I think unusually such kind of detailed account of specific instances in the process. I was thinking about Richard Cole, a colleague in classics at Bristol, who's been working on adaptations of classical myth, but in games, and writing, for instance, about mashups of classical texts in Assassin's Creed. And you talked about Marvel and megatexts and kind of transmedia adaptation. You talked about looping narratives and discovering for yourself. But I guess I was wondering what you thought about whether it's like the dramaturgy of video games, thinking about sandbox games and more kind of open world games that the player explores. And I know Punchdrunk have done some work in that area, and other people have made that comparison with exploring virtual environments. But I wondered what you thought about that.
So, I mean, some people are very invested in this, and I know there's actually at Queensland, Gabrielle Gregg, I should give her a shout out, a PhD student who's just she just submitted on Wednesday, I think it was, a PhD on kind of gaming and immersive theatre. How do I phrase it diplomatically? I'm not as invested in the parallels that people identify between the experience of gaming and the experience of immersive theatre. Perhaps that's not because I'm a big gamer and haven't spent enough time and been exposed to the level of narrative, but for me, the strategies of participation and thinking about kind of Mary Laura Ryan's work, the kind of aim to balance interactivity and immersion and find a way of getting those, can't remember the exact words that she used, kind of top-down narrative strategy and bottom-up interactive strategy. I think those aims are quite similar, and there's a lot of mileage in kind of exploring the kinship between the aims. But I feel like in terms of the creation and thinking about Punchdrunk specifically here, the idea of not kind of writing things from scratch, but basing everything in multiple different reference points and springboarding out of those reference feels distinct to me, where I feel like there's more kind of looser engagement with mythology. I don't know. I mean, I know Richard Cole well. He's writing for the edited collection that I mentioned before. I don't know whether he would kind of, I'd be interested to have a discussion with him, whether he would argue that actually, no, they're very much rooted in trying to braid together lots of different references. But yeah, my gut feeling is that the narrative and the folding of lots of different references into those narratives are heightened within an experience like the Burnt City. So the strategies might be quite similar, but I think that the creation, the process, rather than the product, is distinct.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Emma. Be interesting to well, listen in on that dialogue with Richard to hear the conversation, because I think he does also write about, for instance, Assassin's Creed being a kind of mashup and very intertextual. But yeah, it's interesting to think, I guess, about the kinships and also the differences, which I think there's also significant distinctions, as you point out, around the processes, for instance.
Yeah, I don't know if he'd debate me or not, but yeah, there's definitely similarities. I just don't feel as fully invested as some people that they're the same. I'm sure he wouldn't be saying they're exactly the same, but yeah, some people really seem wedded into bringing them together. And maybe, as I said, it's because I'm not a gamer that I can't quite go all the way in.
Sounds like a panel discussion to me, anyway. Like a future panel discussion. But yeah, I think that's interesting that the process is unique or distinct, and leads to a different way of kind of folding the narrative in.
And that's not to say that one's better than the other as well. This isn't a claim to superiority when I kind of say I think that the process of creation is different. It is just different, is my feeling. One's not a better cultural artifact than the other. Just to make sure I'm not offending anyone in the room.
We're a bit short on time, so what I might do is just read out the two questions that are in the chat, and maybe Emma, you could respond to one or both of them, or together, and then at least everyone that's kind of indicated that they had a question has had a chance to have that aired. So the first one is from Cleo, who says they're interested in the idea of a one-on-one aspect of performance with an audience member experience within the production. I was wondering how Punchdrunk evaluate this experience, or why it's included. I hope I understood you properly. This was a useful presentation for me, particularly as I'm working with West African mythologies, but with the aim of creating understanding and proximity to performers and audience. So I guess, yeah, how they evaluate those one-to-one moments, why they're included in the first place. And then also Alex, who was asking about the non-Greek mythology source texts like Bluebeard. Were you involved in trying to make this blend with the main stories, or was this left to the Punchdrunk team? So something on one-to-one and something on the non-Greek mythology texts.
Sure. So the non-Greek mythology texts are probably easier. So no, I had very little involvement in injecting those in. The kind of real only area that I came in was sometimes they would put an idea to me about kind of blending different things. I can't think of an example from Bluebeard, but the character of Polymestor, who's a Thracian in Hecuba, he is the one that gets blinded at the end. I mentioned Hecuba blinds him. There was a pitch to kind of make Polymestor represent a lot of different sources. Another one of the intertexts, which I didn't mention, was Metropolis, the kind of Fritz Lang film. So sometimes they would say, we're thinking about kind of combining this element from Metropolis with this element of Greek mythology. How does that read to you? Do you know, sometimes I was a bit of a test as, you know, are people going to say, classicist reviewers going to say that we've just kind of bastardized things? Are we taking it too far? So sometimes I'd get kind of a litmus test for things like that. But for Bluebeard, I had very little to do with that. That was in sound design, mainly. They used Bartok's Bluebeard, and they recorded an orchestra playing that. And then they, again, thinking about atomization, they split up all the instruments throughout the space. So in terms of how it played, it wasn't like they played all of Bartok, but they had different bits going, kind of, yeah, all atomized. And then they also had the Hades and the Persephone's characters being infused with the Bluebeard story as kind of Bluebeard and Judith. But they were the kind of Hades and Persephone characters were very heavily performer devised, actually. So all the kind of Greek myth characters were given treatments for almost all the scenes, but the Hades and Persephone loop was almost blank at the start of the rehearsal period. And they were veteran Punchdrunk performers that devised those roles, that had been performing for a very long time, since kind of the early 2000s, I believe. And so they were, you know, very safe hands, those parts. In terms of the one-on-one experiences, why they're included. So Punchdrunk's theatre is of a really epic scale, these masked shows. So for the Burnt City, it was 600 audience members. And Felix Barrett often talked about the one-on-ones being like the rawest experience of Punchdrunk. And he had a a trajectory, if you will, going from a moment of eye contact right through to these 5-minute scenes. And the aim is to try and make as many of those 600 audience members that are in the space feel like they had a moment where the performance was kind of for them alone. It's a lofty ideal, and I think for a lot of people it doesn't come across. They don't get that sense that it was for them, and maybe they spend the whole time disoriented and lost. There was one review for the Burnt City which said, I felt like there was a party happening somewhere and I could never find it. So it doesn't work for everyone. But for those people that get that kind of beat of intimacy, a moment of eye contact, it might be a moment of touch, or one of these one-on-one experiences. It's really supposed to kind of bring those ideas of immersion and interactivity that I was just discussing with Paul into the fore. So that's why they're included. They're really to try and kind of distill the Punchdrunk experience and kind of explode it almost. In terms of the evaluation, so I don't know if you're kind of thinking about the creation and how they're evaluated during the rehearsal period and the development, or once they're up and running in the space. In terms of the rehearsal period, so you have this kind of improvisation period, working with text, props, costume, sound, weaving them all together. The way they are evaluated is then once they've kind of been workshopped, we have the performers kind of share the material. So one might lead the creation and then they hand it over to the other cast member. So you have the red cast and the blue cast, and they might continue to finesse it. And then you start performing it as an experience for the rehearsal directors or the co-directors. It's a really long process. So when the previews started, there were no one-on-ones initially. They need to be signed off before they're performed, which is for two reasons. It's for content, firstly, and then secondly, it's for kind of safeguarding and security. And so that's safeguarding for the audience member and then also safeguarding for the performer. So Punchdrunk have this thing that they call 3 invited no's, where they try and give the audience member 3 opportunities to say no. So it might be that the performer opens a locked door and then stands aside and waits to see if the audience member enters the room. So they do these things where it's audience-led rather than just kind of grabbing someone's hand and yanking them into a private part of the set. So they're constantly trying to check all of these things throughout it before they will sign it off and allow the performer to perform it. And then, I mean, I guess there's kind of continual evaluation for these types of things, because they're individual, the one-on-ones, there's a lot more opportunity to shape things throughout the run. With the size of the performance and the fact that there's so many different cast members, often you've got scenes involving choreography with different people together, but also even if you've got a solo scene, you have to be at your next scene at the right time. You have to make sure that you don't create a bottleneck of audience members if you're passing through the wrong time. So that means that the choreography had to be really, really fixed when you're inside the wider performance space. But in the one-on-one experiences, because it's one performer, sometimes 2, but almost always 1, and you're in a locked room, it does mean that there's a lot more opportunity to change things throughout the run. So anytime that a performer has an idea, wants to try something different, you can go through that kind of approval process again, and get the kind of idea, the new concept evaluated, and continue kind of trying to rework the performance. So I hope that kind of answers your question.
Thanks very much, Emma. I'm aware that we're at just past 11:30 in the UK and 9:30, is it? We just had a very quick question. Where might we access more information about SPA?
Absolutely.
There a link or place you would guide people to?
Three things I will suggest. One, you can email me. I'll put my email in the chat. It's super easy. It's e.cole@uq.edu.au. In my book, I've also got a lot of references. So if you're at Bristol, there should be an ebook at Bristol. If you're not, I can send you the bibliography from my book as well. But the kind of go-to piece is by Helen Iball, Iball, Zerihan Iball, and someone else. There are 3 authors. and it's about a production called I Confess. And actually, let me see if I can Google it while I talk.
I think it's D. Hedden, isn't it?
Yes, it's D. Hedden. Come Closer. Here we go. This is it. Come Closer. Confessions of Intimate Spectators in One-on-One Performance. I'm going to put so this is the kind of first piece that talked about SPA. And it's a co-authored piece by 3 different scholars who are writing about a one-on-one performance that they've each experienced. So this is where it started, and it's since picked up. There was a special issue of a journal, I think on immersive theatre. I'm trying to remember the journal. It's 9:30 at night. I'm going to use that as my excuse. And so there was a special issue of a journal where there were several different scholars that used SPA. It wasn't about SPA. I think it was about immersive and one-on-one performance. But yes, if you email me, I can get you the proper reference. But the Hedden, Ibal, and Zerihan is the kind of the starting point of SPA, and it went on from there. The other, in terms of Punchdrunk and SPA, if you're interested in it, Rose Biggin's work on Punchdrunk, which, hold on, behind me. Immersive Theatre and Audience Experience by Rose Biggin. She says she's using SPA here as well. It's quite different to how I used it today, because she's drawing upon a much bigger range of encounters rather than deep diving into a particular production. So it's not using SPA in rehearsal, but it's drawing upon a SPA methodology and trying to analyze Punchdrunk's work from a different perspective. So that would be another one to potentially look at as well.
That's brilliant. Thanks so much, Emma. So as I said at the beginning, really delighted to have you be our first TaBS talk. And thanks so much for your really great paper. And thanks to everyone for coming. That's it. It's done. Thank you. Say goodbye in the chat if you like, or I know people might need to leave.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming.